The night air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and crushed leaves, the kind that clings to your clothes and refuses to let go. You can almost feel it pressing against your skin, can't you? Somewhere in the distance, a cicada cried out, then another, until the sound became a trembling chorus that seemed to echo every heartbeat in the dark. Imagine standing barefoot on cold wooden planks, feeling the grain press into your skin, listening to a man breathe, like he's drowning on dry land, every breath a struggle, every gasp sounding like it might be the last. And here's the part that makes your chest tighten. Every person in the room knows this man once ruled their lives. With a raised hand, a lowered whip. And now he can't even lift his own head. This wasn't always the sound that filled this plantation house. Once, these walls echoed with boots striking the floor, commands barked sharply, laughter carrying no warmth. The man gasping for air had been the master here, a plantation owner whose name was whispered carefully, sometimes with hatred hidden behind lowered eyes. He owned land, he owned lives, or at least, he believed he did. But tonight? Tonight none of that mattered. Tonight, his body was broken, twisted by a sudden stroke that stole his strength, his speech, almost his dignity. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, ghostly shadows that seemed to bend and stretch across the room. The doctor had already come and gone, shaking his head, offering words that sounded hell. Full but meant almost nothing. If he lives through the night, he said, it will be a mercy. Then he left, and the room fell silent. And then, everyone turned to the door. Walking slowly toward the bed was the last person anyone expected to see. The most hated slave on the plantation. His name was Elijah, and if you asked anyone who worked these fields, they would tell you the same thing. Eli. Jah was trouble. Not loud trouble, not foolish trouble, but the kind that stared back at you without fear, the kind that didn't beg, didn't flinch, the kind that made masters uncomfortable because it reminded them, just for a moment, that chains can bind a body, but not always a spirit. Elijah had been whipped more times than he could count, not for stealing, not for running, but for refusing to low. Okay down when spoken to, for pausing before answering, for holding silence like a shield. Silence, you see, can be dangerous in a world built on obedience, and Elijah wielded it like a weapon. So when word spread that the master lay helpless, barely breathing, many of the enslaved felt something they had never been allowed to feel openly. Relief. Some even felt joy, though they buried it deep, afar. Aid of their own thoughts. Others felt nothing at all, their hearts long exhausted. But Elijah felt something far more complicated. Now, this is where it gets strange, because when the mistress, her face pale, hands trembling, asked if anyone knew how to care for a man who could not move, could not speak, could barely swallow, Elijah stepped forward. You can imagine the shock. The room sank, stiffened, heads turned sharply. Someone whispered his name, like a warning. Why him, of all people? Why Elijah? You see, Elijah had a past with this man, a personal one. Years earlier, Elijah's wife had been taken from him and sold south after the master accused her of being defiant. The accusation had come from nowhere, no proof, no mercy. Elijah had begged that day, begged on his knees until blood ran from his mouth where he bit his tongue trying not to scream. And the master? He watched, calm, cold, unmoved. That was the day Elijah became the most hated slave, not because he fought back, but because something inside him broke in a way that never healed. He stopped asking, stopped pleading, stopped caring if he lived or died. And that terrified the master far more than rebellion ever could. Years later, as Elijah stood by the bed of the man who had destroyed his family, everyone expected one thing: revenge, or at least indifference, to walk away, to let nature finish what fate had started. But Elijah didn't walk away. He picked up a damp cloth and gently wiped tea. He sweat from the master's forehead. Imagine that moment. The room holding its breath. The man on the bed unable to speak, his eyes darting wildly, recognizing the face above him. Fear flashed there. Real fear. Not the fear of losing power, but the fear of dying. At the mercy of someone he once treated as less than human. And here's the question that probably came to your mind too. Why? Why wool? Did Elijah do this? The days that followed were slow, heavy. Time seemed to stretch like it had no end. Elijah was there every morning, every night, feeding the master spoon by spoon, changing his sheets, turning his body so sores wouldn't form, talking softly even though the master couldn't respond. And what Elijah said, that's important. He didn't curse him, he didn't mock him. He spoke about tea, weather, about the fields, about memories of his mother's voice, the way she hummed when she worked. Sometimes he spoke about his wife. Not with anger, with sadness, a deep, aching sadness that filled the room like smoke. "You took her from me," Elijah said one night, voice barely above a whisper. "But you didn't take who I am." The master's eyes filled with tears then, silent ones that roll. Down into his ears, soaking the pillow. For the first time in his life he was forced to listen, to feel, to sit in the weight of another man's pain without the ability to escape it. But there was a problem. The plantation didn't understand mercy. Overseers whispered. Some warned Elijah. "Be careful," they said. "If he lives, he'll remember." Others were angry. "Why save him?" they asked. "Why? Not let him rot?" Elijah heard them all. And still, he stayed, because Elijah wasn't trying to save the master, he was trying to save himself. Hatred, when you carry it long enough, starts to rot you from the inside. Elijah knew that. He had felt it eating away at his sleep, his breath, his prayers. And standing at that bedside, he realized something that changed everything. If he let this man die out of spite, then the master would still own him, even in death. Weeks passed. The master didn't recover, but he didn't die either. He became something unrecognizable. A man who once rode horseback now needed help to sit up. A man who once commanded hundreds now depended on one. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the window, warming the wooden floor. Elijah fed the master broth. When suddenly the master grabbed his wrist, weakly, desperately, mouth trembling, struggling to form words that would never come again. But his eyes said enough. "I'm sorry." Elijah saw not words but truth. He closed his eyes. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he gently freed his wrist, continuing to feed him. "I know," he said. When the master finally died months later, it was quiet. No drama, no cries. Just a final breath slipping away like a tired sigh. Elijah sat with him until the end, holding the hand that once held a whip. And when it was over, Elijah stood, walked outside, and looked at the sky. The same sky he had looked at in chains, the same sky that had watched everything. People would tell this saint, Ori later in whispers. Some would call Elijah weak, others a saint. But the truth is more human than that. Elijah chose not to become what had been done to him. History often teaches us about cruelty, about power, about suffering. But hidden in the cracks are stories like this. Stories that don't fit neatly into anger or forgiveness. Stories that remind us that real strength isn't loud. It does. And announce itself. Sometimes, it sits quietly at the bedside of an enemy and refuses to let hatred have the final word. And maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. Because it asks a question we don't like to answer. If you were standing there, in that room, with that power in your hands, who would you choose to be?